You've seen the movies.
We work for a highly funded yet unofficial government agency.
You've heard the stories.
He was met or contacted by a man in black.
Men in Black.
We are the men in black.
Mysterious figures in dark suits who appear after UFO sightings, intimidate witnesses, and vanish without a trace. For decades, these stories have been dismissed as urban legends, paranoid delusions, or Hollywood fiction. After all, who would believe tales of strange men with pale skin, robotic speech, and encyclopedic knowledge of witnesses' personal lives? But what if these thousands of similar reports spanning 7 decades weren't just stories? What if there was something more behind the myth? I've spent months digging through declassified government documents, tracking down witness testimonies, and mapping patterns that span from the 1950s to the present day. What I discovered left me stunned. A paper trail leading to places I never expected, connecting dots that have been hiding in plain sight for over half a century. Today, I'm going to take you on a journey through the evidence, and by the end, you'll never look at those black suits the same way again. When most people hear Men in Black, they think of Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones hunting aliens, a cultural phenomenon that began as a comic book in 1990 and exploded with the 1997 film. But the concept of mysterious men in black suits intimidating UFO witnesses existed decades earlier. I found accounts going back to the early 1950s, long before Hollywood got involved. Take Albert Bender. In 1953, he ran a civilian UFO research organization when he was visited by 3 men in dark suits who warned him to cease his investigations. At the time, his story was dismissed as paranoia. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, similar reports accumulated. UFO researchers generally dismissed these accounts as delusions or hoaxes. The pattern seemed too bizarre to be credible. But I've obtained thousands of pages of previously classified documents, and they tell a completely different story. To understand what's really going on, we need to go back to the early 1950s, the height of Cold War paranoia. Americans were seeing strange objects in the sky, often near sensitive military installations. The government faced a serious dilemma: how to determine if these sightings represented a genuine threat while preventing public panic. Their solution would set in motion events that continue to this day.
There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. My gosh.
Round object was hovering silently over the missile silo and shining a light.
This planet is being visited by beings from another world.
In January 1953, something happened in the Pentagon that would change everything. The CIA assembled a scientific committee called the Robertson Panel to address what they considered a national security problem. The problem wasn't that UFOs weren't real. The problem was that too many Americans were seeing and reporting them. This panel made recommendations that, on the surface, seemed straightforward. Study the phenomenon scientifically while reducing public interest. But there was something else in these recommendations that caught my attention, something that would become critically important later in our story. The panel explicitly recommended monitoring civilian UFO research groups and implementing measures to reduce public interest in the phenomenon. In March 1953, just 2 months later, the Air Force reorganized its UFO investigation program. Publicly, they called it Project Blue Book and presented it as an objective scientific study. But internal documents tell a completely different story. Blue Book had a dual purpose: collect information while simultaneously reducing public interest in UFOs. Air Force Regulation 200-2 explicitly stated that Blue Book would reduce the percentage of unidentifieds to a minimum and established strict control over the release of UFO information. Meanwhile, the FBI was actively involved in UFO investigations, collecting information on civilian UFO organizations and researchers across the country. But here's where our story takes its first strange turn. In September 1953, just months after the Robertson panel, something unusual starts happening across America. A witness in Lake County, Indiana, reports being visited by two men in dark suits claiming to be government officials who confiscated photographs of an aerial object. The witness described their behavior as odd and mechanical. Over the next 4 years, similar reports start appearing across the country, and the pattern is remarkably consistent. Witnesses who report UFO sightings, especially those with evidence or technical backgrounds, receive visits from men who arrive in pairs, wear identical dark suits, display unusual speech or behavior, possess knowledge about the witness that isn't public, demand physical evidence, and issue warnings against discussing the sighting. At first glance, these reports seem too bizarre to be credible. If you were designing a program to intimidate witnesses, why would you make your agents behave so strangely? Why would they wear identical suits and speak in monotone voices? It seems counterproductive, unless there was another purpose behind these unusual characteristics. As I dug deeper into declassified documents, I began to notice something fascinating. The CIA and Air Force were developing sophisticated approaches to managing public perception of UFO sightings during the Cold War. The Robertson panel had explicitly recommended reducing public interest in UFOs. They suggested using media, education, and even ridicule to diminish the significance of sightings in the public mind. What if the strange behavior reported in Men in Black encounters served a specific purpose? If witnesses described these bizarre details, their entire account would seem less credible to others. But was this just speculation? Or was there evidence of a coordinated program behind these encounters? To answer that question, I needed to look at cases where the government's interest in UFO encounters was undeniable. Incidents involving military personnel and sensitive installations. Let's examine what happened at Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana, on March 16, 1967. At 3:30 a.m., multiple nuclear missiles simultaneously malfunctioned, going into no-go status. Security personnel reported unusual aerial lights over the missile field. What happened next is documented in declassified testimony. Security team members were immediately separated and subjected to extensive debriefing by personnel they'd never seen before. Individuals in civilian clothes, dark suits, but with military bearing. The witnesses were required to follow strict security protocols, specifically prohibiting them from discussing the incident with unauthorized personnel. Robert Salas, the missile launch officer on duty that night, later testified, "We were told in no uncertain terms never to discuss the incident. The men who debriefed us made it clear that our military careers depended on our silence."
I was basically ordered to sign a non-disclosure statement. That same morning that we got relieved by another crew, we were ordered to go to our squadron commander's office and sign this document. From that point on, I spoke to nobody about this incident.
When I compared these military cases with civilian Men in Black reports, I found striking similarities in how witnesses were handled: immediate isolation, specialized debriefing, and implementation of security protocols. But there was still a missing piece. How did this program operate with civilians who had no military obligation to follow orders? The most compelling civilian case I found was Dr. Herbert Hopkins, a Maine physician consulting on a UFO investigation in 1976. Hopkins received a phone call from someone claiming to represent a UFO research group. Minutes later, before anyone could have reasonably traveled from any nearby location, a man in a black suit arrived at his door. Hopkins described his visitor as wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, completely bald with no eyebrows or eyelashes and extremely pale skin. The man demonstrated knowledge of Hopkins' research that wasn't public information. The visitor instructed Hopkins to destroy his research materials, then demonstrated strange abilities, including making a coin dematerialize in his hand. Before leaving, he told Hopkins he would never see him again.
Struck me as a little odd. He wore a black suit, neatly tailored black suit, black shoes, black socks. He then told me that I had tape recordings on the Stevens case, on the hypnosis. I was a little bit frightened after this coin thing happened. I was getting a little uneasy. Then he said I had tape recordings. He didn't ask me. He didn't tell me. He just said it, you know what I mean? So it wasn't an order or anything else. And then he told me that when I admitted it was true, and he also correspondence relating to the case, I admitted this was true. He ordered me to destroy the tapes and any other correspondence. And indeed, anything I had in writing or otherwise that had anything to do with UFOs, even if not connected with this case at all.
What makes this case so significant is Hopkins' credibility as a medical professional and the immediate report he made to local authorities. Other notable cases follow similar patterns. Betty and Barney Hill were visited by individuals claiming to be from a civilian UFO research organization. But that organization officially denied sending anyone.
He asked me that if I knew Barney Hill and Betty Hill. I said, well, I've heard of them. I know of them. I don't know anything about them, though, really. I said, except I think that Barney Hill is dead. And he says, that's right. And he says, do you know what he died from? I said, well, I'm not sure, but I understand he died suddenly, so I think he might have died of a heart attack. And he says, that is not exactly the case. The reason he died was because he knew too much. How he died, I said heart attack. He said, no, because he did not have a heart, just as you no longer have a coin.
After the Cash Landrum incident in 1980, where witnesses suffered radiation sickness after encountering a UFO, they reported visits from men in dark suits who showed interest in their medical records and warned against discussing the case. As I analyzed hundreds of civilian encounters, clear patterns emerged. They target witnesses with physical evidence or technical expertise, demonstrate surveillance capabilities beyond civilian means, and employ intimidation techniques consistent with trained operatives.
2 or 3 nights, 4 nights after they took that photograph, they were all on a cigarette break at the hotel, early evening, pissing rain, car rolled up. There were 3 guys in it, a driver and 2 men in suits in the back. They roll up, they come out, they say, cigarette break's over. They pull the 2 witnesses aside and they grill him. And you got to hear it directly from the horse's mouth. Richard Greaves said that when they were all, the people that were not involved with the incident were told to go back inside the hotel, which they did, but they looked through the window and they saw in the pissing rain, he said they were out there for 10 or 15 minutes in the pissing rain, and that these guys, they came back inside and they were white as a, he said, he literally goes, they came back inside, they were white as a f***ing ghost, and which we all get a good laugh out of. But and then they started drinking heavily, and within a couple of weeks, they vanished without a trace, and they've been gone ever since.
But the question remained, were these isolated incidents or part of a coordinated program? After months of research, I finally found the answer, and it was hiding in plain sight all along. When I cross-referenced the timing of the first reports with the Robertson panel recommendations and the establishment of Project Blue Book, a disturbing picture emerged. The Robertson panel had explicitly recommended monitoring civilian UFO groups and reducing public interest in the phenomenon. Within months, Project Blue Book was established with its dual mission of investigation and debunking. And shortly after that, the first reports began to appear. This wasn't coincidence. This was implementation.
They showed up and they intimidated the shit out of the witnesses.
The men in black weren't aliens. They weren't paranoid delusions. They were the operational arm of a coordinated government program designed to control UFO information through witness management, surveillance, and intimidation. The CIA provided expertise in psychological operations and public perception management. The FBI handled domestic surveillance of civilian UFO organizations and researchers. The Air Force Office of Special Investigations became the primary field operatives, the actual men in black who interacted with witnesses, and the NSA monitored communications of UFO witnesses and researchers. The bizarre behavior that made witnesses seem uncredible wasn't a bug, it was a feature. If witnesses reported men with pale skin, monotone voices, and outdated clothing, they would be dismissed as delusional. By the 1970s, men in black had begun entering popular culture. This created the perfect cover, ensuring that real encounters would be perceived as folklore rather than fact. The government didn't need to suppress these reports. They simply needed to ensure they were perceived as cultural myths. This created the perfect cover for continued operations. What began as a Cold War program to control information about unidentified aerial phenomena evolved into one of the longest-running psychological operations in American history. So what happened to this program as we entered the 21st century? I found evidence that it evolved to adapt to new challenges: digital communication, smartphone cameras, and increased government transparency. In 2007, the Defense Intelligence Agency established the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. It was publicly acknowledged in 2017, investigating UFO under the guise of identifying advanced aerospace threats. Luis Elizondo, the former director of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, revealed that the program included protocols for handling military witnesses to UFO encounters, protocols that mirror earlier patterns we've seen. Current Department of Defense UAP directives establish formal channels that carefully control information flow about encounters. Navy pilots who encountered UFO during the famous Nimitz incidents in 2004 reported unusual debriefing procedures by individuals who weren't part of the regular chain of command. The key evolution, physical intimidation, has largely been replaced by institutional control mechanisms. Military and government witnesses now operate under formal security protocols that specifically include aerial phenomena encounters. In 2022, Congress held the first public hearings on unidentified aerial phenomena in over 50 years. But even as the government acknowledges the reality of these encounters, the mechanisms for controlling information remain in place. These hearings reveal that witness testimonies and encounter data remain highly classified. Vast majority of UAP encounter data still withheld from public disclosure. The Pentagon's UAP Task Force, established in 2020, incorporates elements of the original approach: witness management, information control, and strategic public messaging. What's striking is how effectively this information management operated in plain sight. If these documented programs could function for decades while being dismissed as conspiracy theories, what does that tell us about our information ecosystem? The Men in Black story isn't just about UFOs or government secrecy. It's about how narratives can be shaped, how witnesses can be marginalized, and how cultural myths can serve institutional purposes. And here's what I keep thinking about. What happened to these information management techniques? Did they just disappear when UFO sightings became less prominent in public discourse? Or did they evolve alongside our technology and culture? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. All the documents shown in this video are available through Freedom of Information Act requests. I've put the full source list in the description below. In my next investigation, I'll be looking at Operation Northwoods, the disturbing plan to stage false flag terrorist attacks against American citizens that was approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. If you found this valuable, subscribe for more investigations into documented government programs that shaped our world in ways most people never realize.